Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos, where industry leaders share their thoughts and experience on the future of space business, policy, and opportunity. If you like Constellations, please support us by giving a rating and review on iTunes. And don't forget to share this podcast online to help our community grow.
Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator. Our guest today is Pacôme Révillon, Chief Executive Officer of Euroconsult. Today we're talking about the explosion in satellite capacity and new technology capabilities that are drastically impacting the ground segment. The space segment with high throughput satellites and new mega-constellations are often the focus of the industry, but the ground segment is critical to the success of this end-to-end system. The space and ground segment need to work in tandem to deliver on the promise of satcom and Earth observation applications. In this episode, find out how the ground segment is evolving and the forecast for the future. Today we have someone uniquely qualified to discuss how the ground segment is rapidly evolving to meet the new demands of the advanced satellites in space. Pacôme Révillon is the Chief Executive Officer at Euroconsult, a leading global consulting firm specialized in space markets. He has 15 years of experience working in the space sector and consults with high-level clients, particularly in satellite broadcasting, communications, and finance. In this podcast, Pacôme will share some insights from Euroconsult's recent executive report on the ground segment market prospects forecasts for 2028. Wow, 2028. Wow, that's exciting. There's all kind of excitement today in the space segment. Most of it's involved with companies' new SATCOM and EO solutions using multi-constellations and high-throughput satellites. But Pacôme, we're just hearing now about the impact on the ground. Why has it been so delayed?
Well, first, thanks for the kind introduction. I don't know if I'm uniquely qualified, but we'll try to do my best to share some thoughts. And I'm already moving close to 20 years rather than 15 of experience. Well, coming back to the question, I think certainly the procurement of the space segment itself, meaning space infrastructure, usually starts earlier and tends to be more visible or maybe more symbolic for the media. In addition, it's a fact that looking more at new satellite programs themselves, the space infrastructure usually tends to represent a larger part of the capital expenditure. This being said, and as you certainly rightly pointed out, there will be absolutely no possibility of success for any of the new generation program, would it be in SATCOM or of Earth observation, without innovation and new capabilities coming from the ground segment. And certainly any new design has to come from space to ground in a fully integrated manner. And in addition to that, I would say that even if it's a bit less visible on a global scale, I've had the opportunity to come to quite a number of countries over these 15 years. And at a local level, even today, the presence of a national ground site is often really a national pride. It can represent for a country a guarantee of success or control of its communication and or access to imagery typically. And it will also guarantee to host highly qualified jobs locally. So this, I believe, will also continue to represent an important consideration, in particular in emerging space nations where a lot of the satellite-based solutions are consumed.
Well, let's transition here from the nations themselves to the applications. What applications do you believe will drive growth in this ground segment?
Well, I think there are at least 2 to 3 aspects to consider. If we look really at the network parts that would represent the larger antennas and ground stations, certainly the non-geostationary constellations will represent a key driver for innovation and deployment. And this for 2 obvious reasons. That would be the number of sites involved that could be up to dozens for any new program, and then coming down to the number of antennas that can go over 100, and then all the related equipment. If we then go to really, let's say, the end user level, for what I would call the SATCOM segment, all data-related applications, it's no major news, should and will represent an increasing part of the overall business mix. Most of the broadband networks will also have to come with new ground segments, either to enjoy a better performance and the latest codec and transmission technologies, or just because they will need to use a different frequency band, with in particular the Ka band in the near term. And talking about K-band, and while it's certainly been here for a number of years now, it certainly remains in its infancy in many regions of the world, such as typically in Asia. So overall, in that context, I think universal access, that will be a combination really of public programs, Wi-Fi hotspots, or cellular backhaul will represent key segments. And mobility will also represent a high-value segment in terms of just the price of those ground segment, but also the innovations that will have to come to serve that segment. Just thinking of in-flight connectivity, we are talking about more than 6,000 aircraft to connect and install in the next 3 to 5 years. And in that particular industry, you could see installation of ground terminal, let's say, aero terminals, increasingly coming as a standard line fit installation for new aircraft. On the defense side, military user terminals should also contribute to growth, with new ground segment coming together with the use of both military and commercial systems by defense forces. In the US, certainly modernization programs are underway, as highlighted by the latest defense budgets, while taking the example of Europe, the so-called GovSatcom initiative promoted by the European Commission could favor the use of SATCOM solutions by more government users in the next decade. And, certainly not forgetting Earth observation. In that particular part of the industry, it is more the diversity of platforms and sensors that will play a role in the need for more ground segments, together with two items to consider at least. One is an increasing use of K-band transmissions together with X-band between the satellites and the ground stations that should boost ground segment requirements, but also the need in a number of cases for lower latency, meaning reducing the time from the data capture to the availability of the final product to the end user. And for that purpose, having ground segments located in a number of strategic place locations will be important and should drive installations in the coming year.
You know, Pacôme, with KSAT already having an established position and the introduction of Amazon's ground station and now Viasat entering the as-a-service market, how do you see the cloud and as-a-service ground models evolving in the future?
Well, I think this concept of as-a-service could ring a bell in two directions at least. If you think again of more the SATCOM part of the industry, you could think of the larger presence of the satellite operators as direct customers of ground segments. They increasingly provide managed capacity and services as opposed to provide the raw capacity as they used to do. So to a certain extent, and in that particular value chain, this transition to managed services and capacity looks more like as a service market compared to what it was. In Earth observation, clearly we see an increasing rationale for sharing ground segments, in particular as new constellations get deployed. For the constellations, on the one side, it certainly represents a way to optimize their CapEx spending, while at the same time, it can multiply the points of contact on the ground. Again, it can comply with some requirements that national or local authorities may have, and overall, it will improve the ability to deliver services in a very short time.
In his speech yesterday at the National Space Council meeting, the American Vice President Pence said that in the past decade, more than $22 billion has been invested in nearly 500 different space companies. And he said that in the past decade, more than $22 billion has been invested in nearly 500 different space companies. So there's a lot of new players out there and new players in the future. So who do you think the new players are who will emerge as data, mobility, and 5G become a larger part of the satellite revenue stream?
Well, following, I would say, the current investment, for example, made by Amazon Web Services, it would certainly come as no surprise if certain other companies positioned on data transfers and geoinformation would also position into that market. So certainly we could see in the US or either companies owning data centers or managing data on behalf of clients could get involved. This being said, in addition to tech giants from the US, we could certainly expect their counterparts in typically Russia or China to embrace the same direction. And I would be quite surprised if another player such as Alibaba or other companies from those countries would not propose relatively similar services over the next decade.
That's interesting.
With regard to what I would call more the telecom operators, I think with regards to connectivity, data management, ground segment ownership, certainly relationship between satellite operators and telecom companies will have to evolve in the context of the 5G environment and may have an impact on who would be the ultimate owner of the ground segment in various geographies.
You know, Pacôme, earlier in this interview, you talked about different nations. It's obvious that you're on a plane a lot. You've been in a lot of different places. So if you look at, a regional perspective in different parts of the world, where do you see most of the growth in the ground segment today and in the future?
Well, I think there are two aspects to that question. If you think of where would the customers be located and thinking of the next few years, I think in terms of global volume and dollars, the vast majority of the clients and revenues would still be in what I would call Western countries, typically the US and Europe, where you would find most of the satellite operators typically and a large part of the leading service companies. So in terms of where the, let's say, customer would be located, that could be the place. However, if you think of where the ground segment would be deployed, we certainly talk about global infrastructure and locations, and a vast majority of the networks could actually be deployed in areas such as Africa, Asia, Latin America, etc. I mean, just thinking of the demographics and where a large part of the services would be consumed, certainly Asia and Latin America, for example, would represent important markets.
You know, Pacôme, thousands of people from all over the world have listened to this podcast and are probably listening now. If you're listening and would like to get email alerts when the next episode arrives, then simply go to Google, type in Constellations Podcast. You wind up at Kratos, give us your email, and you send you out a little alert every time we have a new show that comes up. You know, there seems to be a lot of pressure in the space segment to make the ground infrastructure more productive and dynamic and at the same time lowering costs. So how does that become even possible?
Well, again, in our context of innovation, certainly we see the pressure now applying to the entire satellite industry, where with the need to provide higher cost efficiency end-to-end solutions. And while this used to apply initially more on the space infrastructure, for example, clearly now this pressure is addressing all the parts of the industry. And thinking of ground segments, I think one aspect is really about the economies of scale with the manufacturing, for example, of more antennas or baseband equipment. And it's another area where the current development of NGSO constellations is important, because suddenly as you have to deliver a larger number of units, significantly larger number of units, you can start rethinking your manufacturing process, which, however, obviously can come as a cost and can involve its own investment risk. The other aspect is about automation of operations. If you think of the future satellite operators, the need to operate dozens to hundreds of ground stations dynamically, clearly a higher focus on automation and overall how to make, let's say, the value created by the ground segment higher for their users. That could be satellite companies, service providers, or other organizations. So as a third item that's quite important to mention, we start seeing more of a reorganization or consolidation move in the ground segment. And it would come as no surprise to see more organizations joining forces or coming together just to be able to manage larger complexity and be able to optimize the production cost typically.
You know, earlier we talked about ground station as a service, and typically when companies look at as a service moving into the cloud, the word that pops up frequently is standardization, because that really makes it all possible. So what role do you believe standardization needs to play from a ground segment perspective, especially as many operators are looking at 5G as an integral part of their strategy?
Certainly, standardization has been an important concept, also regularly challenging to apply to quite large parts of the satellite activity in the past. But looking at the next decade, it has to play a role to maintain the relevance of satellite-based solutions. So how it could happen? I think possibly further standardization could apply to certain elements of hardware, but as much as that, I tend to consider that additional software layers could facilitate a transition to more digital-driven management of the assets. And that could be a way to try to integrate in a more seamless manner both the satellite infrastructure and ground segments from different networks, constellations, etc., but also having a better integration with the terrestrial telecom networks. Okay. So this being said, I would be humble enough not to claim to be the world-leading expert in deep network integration.
Well, let's stick on the ground here and talk about terrestrial network technologies. You know, there are some terrestrial network technologies such as software-defined networking, open orchestration, and provisioning systems. How are those three or new concepts really impacting the market?
Well, I think that these concepts will certainly have to resonate in the satellite industry, and they will have to address three major requirements that are not necessarily fully captured yet. So the first will be the need to manage seamlessly larger networks of satellite payloads of ground stations. If you look at our environment by 2025 or so, looking at satellite only and looking at what you may need to integrate to serve certain end users, we are talking about multiple constellations of up to hundreds, maybe 1,000 satellites, combining assets in different orbits, and where you may have to dynamically use different ground stations around the world to accommodate traffic and the needs of the end users, depending on the status of the network in really a dynamic manner. And you will need to manage all that network in a largely centralized manner because you will want to limit the manned activity and presence within the network around the world. And not even mentioning that a good part of the assets could be located in pretty remote places. The second part that is very important is we are transitioning to a sector where you could have to dynamically adapt the resource allocations for different clients and applications. Typically, thinking of mobility, you will have assets moving and transitioning from one asset to another, and with different levels of capacity, resources, or applications being run on them. So compared to an industry that has quite fixed in nature, where many clients had a fixed resource allocated and then had a fixed set of applications running, clearly the industry will have to move to a much more flexible commercial approach and flexible management of the applications and resources, almost by the second, shall I say. And the last aspect will be then the need for the integration between that satellite and terrestrial, mostly 5G environments, as operators of the terrestrial infrastructure will be willing to run such networks and such process, such as open orchestration, to manage their resources throughout their entire network that could primarily involve terrestrial, obviously, assets such as mobile base stations, but could also involve some pieces of satellite networks as part of their global services for enterprise, typically. And they may want to apply the same tools and methodology to manage both their terrestrial and satellite-based services.
You know, Pacôme, I'm taking notes as you're speaking. I'm writing down dynamic and flexible, all kinds of changes in the market now. So what changes in the ground segment do you believe will need to happen for the SATCOM market to continue to be viable, to make money in this area?
Well, I think they are. That's a pretty interesting and critical question. I think first, if you look at the global picture, one absolute critical aspect for the entire satellite sector and ecosystem is to make sure that end users, wherever and wherever they are, can embrace the new satellite-based solutions that can be either connectivity or imagery or other resources. And in the environment where we'll have a transition to a number of legacy services that used to generate most of the revenues for the industry to a new environment that will be data-driven, to a certain extent closer to terrestrial telecoms and ICT industry, where you will have an exponential growth in the volume of data you need to exchange and carry. And in order to do that, you will have to make sure to have a fully efficient end-to-end solution. So just taking very concrete examples, constellations, VHTS satellite systems, the promise of terabit satellites, terabit systems and traffic can only happen if new generation of ground antennas, mobile antennas in particular, is cost-effective enough and flexible and reliable enough to support those networks. And talking about the end users, we talk about pretty cheap, highly flexible antennas and units that the end users will be able to enjoy. So to that respect, the innovation and the ability to provide those equipment at scale and at a lower cost is critical. It's where I think innovation in manufacturing process and potentially even digital transformation. So Industry 4.0 is a big word, but certainly we'll start more of that applied to the satellite industry, including the ground segment. Digital RF, digitizing a good part of the RF chain is one good example of where innovation could also take place. So that's an important part. Overall, I think part of the ground segment industry, if you think of baseband solutions, have had for a long time an obligation to conduct a strong innovation policy. If you think of baseband equipment modem of 10 years ago and today, capabilities have changed quite dramatically. I think the same will have to apply to the entire ecosystem compared to the situations that used to prevail. And some new topics, such as cybersecurity, may also take more importance in the future and will have to be addressed, would it be for commercial or government solutions.
Pacôme, you have a pretty good handle on legacy system integration, cybersecurity, scaling. Now I'm going to take and throwing the time machine 5 years from now. And when you look back, or you look in the next 10 years, what changes do you think will happen from the ground segment perspective? What are you predicting is going to happen in 5 years?
Well, I think where we really see a change today is that if you think of 5 years from today, we really talk about a complete new generation of ground segments that will have been deployed. If you used to think of baseband equipment, 5 years was kind of good cycle for new generations, but this has just been accelerating. If you think of the number of gateways, ground segments, and new infrastructure that will be in the sky, and as opposed to legacy equipment, I think we'll have an accelerated upgrade of what used to exist and the deployment of brand new solutions all around the world. So that's really an important part. And in parallel, if we look at the industry as it is today, I believe that while we saw already some more mergers, for example, within service providers in the satellite ecosystem, and could see some also at the level of space infrastructure, with a lot of reorganization that has already taken place in the US typically, I expect that we'll see a deeper transformation of the ground segment industry. I would be very surprised if there was not a number of mergers, acquisition partnerships that would allow the company to get scale, get access to new capabilities or technologies, and that will allow the new leaders in the industry to embrace the new complexity and be able to have even more ambitious innovation strategies and policies moving forward. So to that respect, I really think that we'll see a change in the ecosystems. And between those potential new leaders or reorganized companies and startups that could continue to emerge and challenge them, there will be a particular challenge for small-sized companies that used to exist in a context of more stable industry, and that will have to really reinvent themselves. And if they want to remain players in the future environment, they will have to specialize in high-value solutions, addressing maybe niche or exquisite requirements, but that will allow them to maintain the differentiation. I think contributing to the overall efficiency of the industry and solutions, but also the ability to differentiate and innovate in a continuous manner will be really what we will observe, and will be, I think, a major wave in the next 5 years for the ground segment industry.
Well, Pacôme, a lot of insight there. I can't wait till I read the transcript from this and pick out some quotes there. I think you've delved very deeply into many different aspects of ground segment and what's going to happen in the future. And unfortunately here, we're running out of time. I'd like to thank our guest, Pacôme Révillon, Chief Executive Officer of Euroconsult.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. If you like this interview, please subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a review.